They called it the Apache shame, but he turned it into his greatest pride. The desert of southern Arizona baked under a merciless sun, its rugged hills and dry washes shimmering like hammered copper. In a small settlement called Burnt Creek, where adobe houses sat beside clapboard stores and the air smelled of mesquite smoke, Daniel Kehoe worked silently at the edge of a corral. He was 26, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell loose around his face and eyes the color of wet stone. Eyes that always seemed to be measuring distance. He kept his head down as he mended the fence, because looking up too long meant meeting the stares of men who muttered when he passed. The townsfolk called it the Apache shame. Sometimes the phrase came out as a hiss, sometimes as a joke told too loudly in the saloon, but always with the same edge. Daniel had been born of an Apache mother and a white father, an affair neither family would speak of openly. His father had drifted on years ago. His mother had died of fever when Daniel was 10. Since then he'd been a ward of the town, tolerated for his strong back but never welcomed. In Burnt Creek's eyes, Daniel embodied everything they feared and scorned about the people they had fought during the wars. A living reminder of raids, burned homesteads, and blood spilled on the trails. He tried not to care. He worked harder than any man at the livery. He spoke little, drank less, and paid his debts. But even in silence he could feel the weight of their judgment pressing against his shoulders. The children of Burnt Creek would whisper as he passed, "That's him. The Apache shame." He was both an object of fascination and revulsion, a man without a place sometimes at dusk. When the air cooled and the desert began to smell of sage, Daniel would walk out past the last houses toward the open land. Out there he could almost breathe. He would see the far mountains rising blue against the horizon and think of his mother's stories, of her father's band who had once hunted deer there, of the rivers that ran year-round before the army dammed them. He remembered her voice soft but proud, speaking of the Apache as fierce and free. But in Burnt Creek that pride had been recast as shame, and he had learned to swallow the words like dry bread. Now he lived between two silences. Among the whites, he was the Indian they feared. Among the Apache on the nearby reservation, he was the boy who had abandoned his people. When he had gone there once to bring supplies, the older men had stared at him with hard eyes, and the young boys had turned their backs. He was too white for one world, too Indian for the other. This morning, as he finished the fence repair, a wagon clattered by on the road, carrying crates under a canvas tarp. The driver gave Daniel a cold glance, but no greeting. Dust rose in its wake, stinging his throat. He didn't know it yet, but that wagon, and the stolen weapons hidden under its tarp, would soon pull him into a storm bigger than any he had faced. For now he only wiped the sweat from his brow, set down his hammer, and tried not to hear the two men by the saloon steps muttering about half-breeds and bad blood. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself he could keep his head down and survive. But as the sun dropped lower and the cicadas sang, a restlessness stirred inside him. It was the same restless feeling that had driven his mother's people across the deserts and mountains, refusing to be broken. Daniel didn't yet realize that what the town called shame was not a curse but a seed. One day soon he would be forced to choose, run from it or plant it deep and let it grow into something no one could take from him. Dawn broke pale over Burnt Creek, the first light spilling like water across the desert floor. Daniel rose from the cot in his small shack behind the livery. The boards creaked as he moved. He splashed his face with water from a tin basin, scrubbed the grit from his hands, and shouldered his hat. Another day, another few coins earned, another day to keep his head down. On the surface, nothing in Burnt Creek had changed since the war ended. The same false-fronted buildings lined the street. The same church bell tolled each Sunday. But Daniel knew how much had changed for the people around him. Many settlers had lost family to raids or army skirmishes. Some had fled burned-out homes farther east and carried their grief like a badge. Their hatred was older than he was, older than the reservation fences. Daniel walked toward the stable, nodding to no one. Two ranchers passed him, conversation stopping mid-sentence until he was gone. A boy playing with a hoop glanced up, then pulled the toy closer as if Daniel might steal it. All his life he had been moving through these moments, like a ghost people could see but did not want to touch. He tried to keep his work life separate from the Apache side of himself. He cut his hair shorter than most of his kin. He dressed in plain work shirts and denim. He spoke English without an accent. Still, the whispers followed him. When he went into the general store, the owner always counted his change twice. At the saloon, no one sat near him unless every other seat was full. Even the sheriff, a leathery man named Pike, called him Kehoe like it was an insult. And yet when he went to the reservation, things were no better. He had been there 3 times in as many years, always carrying supplies or trying to speak to his grandfather, White Hawk. Each time he felt the weight of eyes on him. The old women looked at him with pity, the young warriors with suspicion. The children, who might have been his cousins, would whisper in Apache words he had forgotten. Once, a boy about 15 had spat in the dust near his boots and muttered, "Not one of us." Daniel had no answer for him. He had been raised in Burnt Creek after his mother died. He spoke more English than Apache. His hands were calloused from carpentry and horses, not from the bow or lance. He could not fault them for their anger. He was a bridge between 2 worlds that neither wanted to cross. He had begun to accept that life. He worked, he slept. He stayed on the edges. If he was quiet enough, careful enough, perhaps he could outlast the scorn. But the land itself seemed to whisper otherwise. In the evenings when he walked out beyond the last houses, the horizon stretched wide and empty, and something in him reached for it like a thirsty plant. He remembered fragments of his mother's songs, words about freedom and honor and belonging. They felt like echoes from another lifetime. That morning as he fed the horses, a wagon rumbled up to the livery. 2 strangers, one with a scar running from his ear to his chin. They had hard eyes, the kind that measured everything. They handed over their reins without a word, just a nod, and Daniel noticed the smell of gun oil rising from their gear. Under the tarp in the wagon bed, he glimpsed wooden crates marked with army stencils, half scraped off. He looked away before they caught him staring. But the moment settled in his gut like a stone. Something was moving through Burnt Creek, something dangerous, and he had the sense, deep and cold, that he would not be allowed to remain an invisible man much longer. He finished his work, brushed the dust from his hands, and watched the strangers disappear into the town. The line between the 2 worlds he straddled felt thinner than ever. Sooner or later it would break, and when it did, he would have to decide who he truly was. The trouble began at noon, when Burnt Creek's heat pressed down like a hammer and the air shimmered above the packed dirt street. Daniel was working in the back of the livery, pitching hay into the stalls when he heard the clatter of boots and a voice barking his name. He turned to see Sheriff Pike and 2 deputies standing in the doorway, hands resting on their pistols. Pike's face was lined and red from the sun, his eyes narrow as a hawk's. "Kehoe," the sheriff said. "Step out here a minute." Daniel wiped his hands on his trousers and did as he was told. The horses stirred nervously behind him, catching his unease. Pike looked him up and down the way he always did, like a man sizing up a snake. "You were seen near the stage road yesterday?" Pike asked. Daniel frowned. "I walked out past the wash at sundown. That's no crime." "Depends what you were doing," Pike said. "We had a wagon carrying army property disappear. Rifles, ammunition. Witness says a half-breed was trailing them before they were hit." Daniel felt the heat rise in his chest. "I work here every day. Ask anyone. I've never stolen a thing in my life." Pike's lips thinned. "Maybe you didn't lift it yourself. Maybe you passed word to your cousins on the reservation. Either way, I got orders to bring you in." One deputy stepped forward with cuffs. The livery boy, a freckled kid named Owen, stood frozen with a broom in his hands, eyes wide. Daniel wanted to speak, to argue, but he saw in Pike's face that the decision was made. In Burnt Creek, an accusation against an Apache, even a half Apache, was as good as a conviction. He held out his wrists, jaw tight as the iron bit his skin. They marched him down the street, dust rising with every step. People came out of doorways to watch. A woman whispered to her friend. A man spat in the dirt. Daniel stared straight ahead, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing shame. Inside, though, a familiar ache clawed at him. This was what they had always waited for, the moment when the Apache shame would prove itself. The jailhouse smelled of old sweat and tobacco. Pike shoved Daniel into a cell with a cot and a tin bucket. "We'll see what the army says when they get here," he muttered. "Could be you're in a lot deeper than you think." When the door clanged shut, Daniel sat on the cot and stared at the floorboards. He replayed the morning in his mind. The wagon with the scar-faced man, the crates under the tarp, the smell of gun oil. He hadn't known what it meant then, but now the pieces began to fit. Someone was moving stolen weapons through Burnt Creek, and the easiest way to cover their tracks was to pin it on the man everyone already distrusted. Through the bars, he could hear the deputies talking. They mentioned a rumor, a band of outlaws planning to attack an army patrol near the reservation, then leave Apache arrows in the bodies to make it look like a massacre. The words chilled him. If the outlaws succeeded, the army would retaliate without hesitation. His mother's people would suffer for a crime they hadn't committed. Daniel stood and gripped the bars until his knuckles went white. He felt the two halves of his life pressing in on him, the town that hated him, the tribe that doubted him. For years he had tried to stay invisible, to survive between them, but if he stayed in this cell, silent, the people he had never quite belonged to would pay in blood. That night, as the sun bled out behind the hills and the first stars showed, Daniel made a decision. He would not sit and wait to be blamed. He would not let his mother's people be slaughtered because he had been too afraid to act. Somehow he would get out, find the truth, and stop what was coming. The shame they had branded on him his whole life. Maybe that could become his weapon. The cell was hot and dark after sundown, the smell of dust and iron filling Daniel's lungs. Outside, the cicadas shrilled like 1,000 needles. He sat on the cot and waited until the voices in the front room faded and the lamplight dimmed. When he was sure the deputies were dozing, he reached under the cot where the frame met the wall and pried loose the iron peg he had spotted earlier. With a steady hand, he worked the pin into the lock. Years of fixing harness buckles and wagon chains had taught him the feel of metal under pressure. The lock clicked. Daniel eased the door open and slipped out into the night. The sheriff's dog stirred but did not bark. Daniel tossed it a scrap of jerky he had saved from his supper. He crossed the street without a sound, staying to the shadows. Within minutes, he was at the edge of town, then running across the scrub flats, lungs burning. By dawn, he was far from Burnt Creek, heading toward the reservation. The journey felt both strange and inevitable. He moved through country he had only glimpsed from a distance. Mesquite thickets, dry arroyos, the faint tracks of deer and javelina. His mother had told him of these trails long ago, and his body remembered them even when his mind did not. Each step deeper into Apache land seemed to strip away a layer of the life he had built in Burnt Creek, the careful silence, the bowed head. Out here, he was not the town's shame. He was a man running toward something older, something that had always been waiting. He reached the reservation near noon. The land was stark but alive. Clusters of willow near the trickle of a stream, smoke curling from low houses, women grinding corn on stone metates. As he walked in, conversation faltered. Faces turned toward him unreadable. Some of the younger men moved to block his path until an older woman called them off with a word. He kept walking until he reached the council shelter, a circle of poles and woven mats where the elders sat in the shade. White Hawk was there. Daniel had not seen his grandfather in 15 years. The old man's hair was silver now, braided with a hawk feather, his face lined like the desert hills. His eyes, though, were the same, sharp and steady. For a long time, they simply looked at each other. "I've come to warn you," Daniel said finally, his voice rough. "Outlaws stole army rifles. They mean to make it look like your people did it. The army will come if we don't stop them." White Hawk's expression did not change. "Why bring this now?" he asked in Apache. "You live among the whites. You wear their clothes. You speak their words," Daniel swallowed. "Because I am still your blood. Because I won't see you slaughtered for a lie." A murmur ran through the elders. Some shook their heads. Others eyed him with suspicion. One man, younger than White Hawk, spoke sharply about the half-man who carries trouble with him. Daniel stood his ground. White Hawk raised a hand for silence. He studied his grandson as if weighing stone against feather. At last he said, "You were born of two fires. You have walked away from us, but you have come back with a warning. If your words are true, you will show us. Go with our scouts. Find these rifles. Bring proof." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a chance. Daniel bowed his head slightly. "I will." As the council dispersed, an older woman pressed a water skin into his hands. "Your mother sang of you," she whispered. He felt the sting of tears, but said nothing. That evening, as the sun slid behind the mountains, Daniel sat with the scouts preparing to ride. For the first time in years, he felt the rhythm of the language on his tongue, the smell of sage fire in his hair. He was not yet accepted, but he was no longer a ghost between worlds. He was moving toward the heart of his mother's people, and toward the fight that would decide everything. The scouts rode out at first light, 3 silent men moving like shadows through the mesquite and cactus. Daniel followed on a borrowed pony, the leather saddle creaking under his weight. The sky was a pale sheet of silver behind the mountains, and the air smelled of creosote from the night's rain. He had been away from this land so long that every plant, every call of a bird felt like both a stranger and an old friend. The 3 scouts, Taza, a wiry man with hawk eyes, Nantan, tall and quiet, and a younger boy named Chago, hardly spoke to him at all. When they did, their words were clipped, practical. Watch for sign. Stay close, Daniel understood. He was an outsider earning his place. The horses moved single file through dry washes, leaving only faint impressions in the sand. Daniel used every skill he remembered from childhood to keep pace, reading faint scuffs of boots on rock, broken branches, the smell of smoke far off. With every mile, his body seemed to remember more of what it had once known. They reached the stage road near dusk. The desert stretched wide and open, a place where a man could disappear or die unnoticed. Nantan raised a hand. Tracks, he murmured. The 4 dismounted and studied the ground. Heavy wagons, at least 2, one missing a wheel rim, boot prints like nails punched into hard clay. Daniel crouched and touched a scuffed imprint. 3 days old, he said without thinking. The scouts glanced at him. Taza gave the smallest of nods but said nothing. They followed the trail into a narrow canyon where boulders leaned against one another like sleeping giants. There they found a smoldering campfire and a torn army crate. The stenciled letters on its side, U.S. Cavalry, had been partially scraped off just like the crates Daniel had glimpsed in Burnt Creek. The smell of gun oil and sweat lingered. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry. While the scouts spread out to search, Daniel's attention was caught by movement on a ridge above. A figure in a calico dress stood silhouetted against the sky, a rifle slung across her back. Before he could speak, she scrambled down the rocks, sending pebbles skittering. It was Clara Evans, the young schoolteacher from Burnt Creek. Her hair was loose, her dress dusty, but her eyes were sharp. Daniel remembered her as one of the few townspeople who treated him without contempt, though even she had always kept a polite distance. Now she looked at him with surprise and relief. "You," she said, catching her breath. "Thank God. I've been trying to find someone who'd believe me." Daniel glanced at the scouts. Their faces were guarded, hands near their weapons. "Clara, what are you doing out here?" "I followed them," she said quickly. "The men with the scar, you saw them, didn't you? They're planning to ambush an army patrol near the reservation, leave Apache arrows behind. I overheard them in the boarding house. No one in town would listen to me." Her words fit perfectly with what Daniel had feared. He stepped closer. "We're already tracking them. If you're right, they're moving toward the North Pass." Taza spoke in Apache, low and wary. "A white woman here? How do we know she speaks truth?" Daniel translated, and Clara's jaw tightened. "I don't expect you to trust me," she said. "But I can take you to where they're heading." I marked their trail. For a moment, no one spoke. The wind hissed through the canyon like a whisper. Finally, Daniel said, "We need every scrap of information we can get. She stays with us." The scouts exchanged glances. Nantan gave a curt nod. Taza still looked unconvinced, but did not argue. As they prepared to ride again, Daniel felt the weight of the moment. For the first time, his 2 worlds, the one he'd tried to leave behind and the one that had rejected him, were converging. A white woman standing beside Apache scouts, trusting him to lead. He realized with a faint jolt that he had begun to lead already. That night, as they camped under a canopy of stars, Clara sketched a map of what she'd seen in the dirt. Daniel listened, his mind already working through the possibilities. He was no longer just a man running from shame. He was part of something larger, a fragile alliance that might be the only chance to stop a war before it began. By the second day, the group had crossed into country so rough, even the horses picked their way carefully. Hooves clinking against hidden stone, heat shimmered up from the sand like ghosts, and the only sound was the hiss of wind in the creosote. Daniel rode at the front with Clara behind him, and the 3 scouts fanned out, eyes constantly scanning. They had picked up the outlaws' trail again, deep wagon ruts, scattered cartridge boxes, boot prints too heavy to be anything but men carrying rifles. At a narrow defile where the canyon walls rose sheer on both sides, Nantan raised a hand. "Track's end," he murmured. "They know we follow." Daniel's stomach tightened. He dismounted and crouched, running his fingers along the sand. The wagon rut stopped abruptly, as though the heavy loads had been lifted away. He could smell smoke, faint and high, coming from somewhere above, a classic ambush ground. He looked at Clara. "Stay close to the rocks," he whispered. They had just begun to edge back when the first shot cracked down from the rim. Stone splintered near Daniel's head. Horses reared and screamed. The canyon filled with echoing gunfire. "Down!" Daniel shouted. He grabbed Clara and pulled her behind a boulder. Taza and Nantan returned fire from behind scrub, their rifles snapping. The boy Chago darted for cover, a bullet kicking up dust inches from his feet. For a moment, Daniel's old instinct to freeze, to hide, flashed up. But the noise, the smell of powder, the sting of grit on his face brought another part of him alive. The part that had tracked deer with his grandfather as a boy, the part that had watched white soldiers drill and had learned their tactics from the edges of their camps. Two halves of one man finally in the same place. "They're up on both sides," Clara whispered. Her face was pale but her eyes steady. Daniel peered around the boulder. He saw 3 men above, 2 with rifles, 1 with a revolver. They had the high ground, but were exposed when they leaned out to shoot. "We can't stay pinned," he said. "We need to move them," he called to Taza and Apache. "Smoke them out." Taza nodded and dug into his saddlebag, pulling out a small bundle of pitch-soaked sage. He lit it with a match and lobbed it into the dry brush below the outlaw's perch. Thick white smoke began to curl upward, stinging eyes and throats. At the same time, Daniel took a different tack. He tied his hat to a stick and thrust it out from behind the boulder, drawing fire. When 2 of the men leaned forward to aim, he snapped his rifle up and fired twice in quick succession. One outlaw toppled back with a shout, his rifle clattering. The other ducked, coughing from the smoke. "Now!" Daniel shouted. He scrambled up the side of the canyon using handholds only an experienced climber would know, Clara close behind under covering fire from Nantan. Bullets hissed past but missed. Daniel crested the rim and launched himself at the nearest outlaw. They crashed into the dust, rolling. The man swung a knife. Daniel caught his wrist, twisting until the blade dropped. He drove his fist into the man's jaw, knocking him cold. Below, the remaining outlaws saw the tide turning and began to retreat toward their wagon hidden in a dry wash. Clara fired a warning shot over their heads, forcing them to drop a crate. When the gunfire finally died, the canyon was silent except for the crackle of burning sage. Taza and Nantan climbed up to join them. Chago retrieved the fallen crate. Inside, army rifles neatly packed in straw, proof of everything Daniel had claimed. He stood over the captured outlaw, chest heaving, smoke and sweat streaking his face. He felt no shame now, only a strange, fierce clarity. The same blood that had made him an outcast had given him the skills to survive this fight. White tactics, Apache cunning, all fused into one. Clara touched his arm lightly. "If you hadn't been here," she said, then stopped, shaking her head. Daniel looked out over the canyon, the stolen weapons, the men scrambling away into the desert. For the first time, he wasn't thinking of himself as caught between 2 worlds. He was thinking of how to stop these men before they reached the patrol and sparked a war. The trial by fire had burned away his hesitation. Now he was ready to lead. The night after the canyon fight, their small camp was quiet but tense. The captured outlaw sat tied to a mesquite tree, glaring at Daniel with eyes full of hate. Beside him lay the open crate of rifles, undeniable proof of the plot. Taza kept watch while Nantan scouted the trail ahead. Clara sat by the fire, sketching another rough map in the dirt with a stick. Daniel crouched near her, thinking. "They'll regroup," Clara murmured. "The rest of them will push onto the pass before dawn." Daniel nodded. "If they reach the army patrol, everything we've done won't matter." He looked at Taza. "We can't just show the rifles after the fact. We have to stop the ambush before it happens." The Apache scout's eyes glinted in the firelight. "You lead," he said quietly. "You know their tactics." It was the first time Taza had spoken to him without suspicion. Daniel felt the weight of it. All his life he had been waiting for someone, white or Apache, to see him as more than a shameful reminder. Now in this small circle of firelight he was being handed responsibility instead of scorn. He rose and addressed them all. "We move before dawn. We'll cut across the high ridge and get ahead of them. When they try for the patrol, we'll be waiting. They broke camp in the cold hours before sunrise, climbing the ridge under a sky streaked with starlight. The terrain was brutal, loose scree, jagged boulders, but Daniel moved with purpose, guiding them through switchbacks he had only half remembered from his mother's stories. Clara kept pace without complaint, her rifle slung across her back. Chago, the youngest, followed close behind, eyes bright with a mix of fear and excitement. By mid-morning they reached a bluff overlooking the narrow valley where the army patrol would pass. From up here, Daniel could see the outlaws below, positioning stolen rifles among the rocks, planting Apache arrows in the dirt for effect. It was exactly as Clara had overheard. "They're going to fire on the soldiers from both sides," she whispered. Daniel scanned the ground, mind working fast. The outlaws had numbers and surprise, but they didn't know they were being watched. "We'll turn their trap against them," he said. He outlined a plan quickly. Nantan and Taza would circle wide and cut off the outlaws' retreat. Clara would signal the patrol with a strip of white cloth. Daniel would draw the outlaws' fire, giving the soldiers a chance to see the real enemy. No one questioned him. They moved into position like pieces on a board. When the first army wagons rattled into the valley, Daniel stepped out from the rocks above, waving his arms. A shot rang out from the outlaws, narrowly missing him. He ducked and fired back, drawing more gunfire. But this time, the patrol below halted instead of riding into the trap. Clara's white cloth fluttered, catching the officer's eye. Soldiers began to spread out, rifles raised. At the same moment, Nantan and Taza swooped down from the far side, cutting off the outlaws' escape route. Gunfire cracked through the valley, echoing off the cliffs. In the confusion, Daniel leapt down to tackle one of the leaders, wrenching the rifle from his hands. Soldiers surged forward to help, and within minutes the ambush was broken. When the dust cleared, the outlaws lay disarmed and bound. The officer in charge, Colonel Rourke, strode over, face hard. "We were told Apaches were behind this," he said. Daniel gestured at the captured men and the planted arrows. "You were lied to. These men tried to start a war." Rourke studied him, then nodded slowly. "You saved my patrol, and their lives." He extended a gloved hand. After a moment's hesitation, Daniel took it. Around them, soldiers and Apache scouts worked side by side to gather the stolen weapons. Clara caught Daniel's eye and gave a small, tired smile. In that moment, he felt something shift inside him. The shame that had haunted him all his life was gone, burned away in the heat of action. He had stood between two worlds and stopped them from destroying each other. That was not shame, that was pride. 2 weeks after the ambush, the valley was quiet again. The soldiers had returned to their fort, the outlaws were in custody, and the stolen rifles had been locked away. A thin veil of rain had passed over the desert that morning, and now the air smelled of wet earth and creosote. Daniel stood on a rise above Burnt Creek, looking down at the town that had once been his cage. It seemed smaller now, as though the weight of his fear had been the thing that had made it loom so large. He rode slowly into town. People stopped what they were doing to stare, but their eyes were different. Less suspicion, more curiosity, even a flicker of respect. Children who used to whisper Apache shame under their breath now pointed and whispered something else. "That's the man who saved the soldiers." A few of the men at the saloon even raised their hats as he passed. Sheriff Pike came out from the jailhouse looking older, more tired. "Kehoe," he said gruffly. "Didn't think I'd see you again." Daniel met his gaze without flinching. "I told you I was no thief." Pike shifted, cleared his throat. "Looks like you weren't." He paused, then added quietly, "Town owes you." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but in Pike's language it was as close as he would come. Daniel nodded once and rode on. He didn't linger. Burnt Creek had been his proving ground, not his destination. He turned his horse toward the reservation instead, where a council meeting was being held under the shade of cottonwoods. The elders sat waiting, White Hawk at the center, the scouts on either side. Clara was there too, standing with folded hands, her face bright in the afternoon light. White Hawk rose slowly when Daniel approached. "You have done what you said you would do," the old man said. "You stopped the blood before it was spilled." Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. "I only did what was right." "You did more," White Hawk replied. "You stood between two fires and did not burn." His voice softened. "Our people have long memories. For many, your name was a wound. Now it can be something else. You can be something else." Daniel looked around at the faces, some still wary, others openly admiring. He thought of the children who would grow up hearing a different story than the one he had been given. Not a story of shame, but of a man who had taken the burden of two worlds and turned it into a bridge. "I want to help," he said quietly. "Teach the young ones. Show them how to read the land and read a map. Show them how to deal with the soldiers without fear. Help the settlers understand who we are." Whitehawk inclined his head. "Then stay. You are welcome." Later, as the sun dipped low, Daniel walked with Clara by the stream. She had decided to remain at the reservation school for the time being, teaching Apache children as well as settlers' children. "They're already calling you the Bridge," she said with a small smile. "That's what the kids are saying." Daniel laughed softly, a sound even he wasn't used to hearing. "Better than Apache shame." He looked out over the hills where mesquite and sage shimmered in the evening light. For the first time, he didn't feel torn between halves. He felt whole, anchored in a place he had chosen. His mother's stories no longer felt like echoes. They felt like roots. As the stars began to prick the sky, Daniel knew the town's old insult had lost its hold. The name they had used to wound him had become the story of how he saved them all. The Apache shame had turned into a legend of courage, a tale of unity. It was no longer a curse. It was his greatest pride and the beginning of a new legacy.